All right, so the what we need to finish here in this section is just a little information about some neurological diseases and a little bit about types of neurons and reflexes. So just finishing up a few different things. Yes.
On the quiz, are we going to have to label the spinal cord?
Oh, I could not do that last
Yeah.
time.
Wait, are we gonna have to label things?
Yes, we're going to have to label a bunch of things.
Also put
I'll tell you all about it.
I don't even
Please
think
don't
there's
put
a
it on
diagram.
the
I think
ground.
you can think there's a labeled diagram in the notes.
There is a.
Yeah,
Exactly, there is.
Like a little sheet.
Yeah. Do you think I can use?
So often when we draw and label a neuron, we draw sort of that typical neuron that you had previously in your notes. But neurons are actually pretty variable, and they don't all look identical. There's different types of neurons, and so this shows a few types of neurons. So there are some neurons which we call a sensory neuron. And as the name would imply, their purpose is to transmit sensory information from various receptors to our central nervous system. So sensory neurons take information from your retina and bring it into your brain, taking that sensory information about what you see and bringing it into your central nervous system. You have sensory neurons attached to pressure receptors in your skin that give you your sense of touch. You have temperature receptors in your skin that allow you to feel the temperature of something. And this information gets relayed into the central nervous system via these sensory neurons. There are also, I'm going to skip down here, motor neurons, which take information from our central nervous system to various effectors within our body, various parts of our body that have some sort of response to a stimuli. For example, motor neurons connect to our muscles. And so when our brain sends a message telling the muscle to contract, that message goes down the central nervous system and then moves out to the peripheral nervous system through these motor neurons. And they attach to or are connected to muscle cells, which when they receive that impulse, they contract. And then connecting these sensory and motor neurons are what we call interneurons. These are the neurons that make up our central nervous system. They're responsible for interpreting messages coming in and processing information. Okay? And so you see here a few different examples of this is a motor neuron. Okay, and you see it attaches here to a muscle fiber. Okay? Sensory neurons, where we have pressure receptors in our skin. And so these sensory receptors take usually physical stimuli and sort of transfer it into a nerve impulse so we can feel something. Okay? And then in between are these interneurons, which interconnect them. So here what you see is an example of this. We have our skin cells here, and we have these receptors, these special parts that are adapted to receiving information. Let's say they're temperature receptors. And so they respond to changes in temperature, and they start a nerve impulse that tells the temperature. So that gets relayed here. This is a sensory neuron, taking sense information in and transmitting it. And it transmits in, this would be an interneuron here. It's connecting this sensory neuron to a motor neuron. So this interneuron here takes that information and passes it on. And then this would be a motor neuron. Again, it's a neuron that connects. Here it's connected to an effector, a skeletal muscle in this case. And so that information gets passed from sensory neurons to interneurons to motor neurons, allowing us to respond to various stimuli. One special case of the this in action is what we call the reflex arc. We talked about this a little before. Reflex is an automatic response to some stimuli that does not need any processing in the brain. Okay? If you were to touch the cactus in the back of the room like this person, okay, you would immediately, as that spine from the cactus pokes you, you would immediately pull your hand away. Okay? And that would be a reflex. And the way reflexes work is they take strong sensory information. Okay? For example, touching that cactus is a strong stimulus causing pain. Okay? It generates that impulse, it sends it through sensory neurons into the spinal cord. Okay, this is the spinal cord. Okay? And then interneurons connect that sensory neuron directly to a motor neuron. And then that nerve impulse, the response is to send a signal down to the muscles, okay, telling them to immediately pull your hand away. Okay? And so that very quick response, that reflex, is a protective response. It's an adaptation that you don't damage yourself more than as little as possible. If you feel something hot, if you touch a hot plate, you immediately pull your hand away very quickly. You don't have to think about it. That nerve impulse doesn't need to go all the way up to your brain, be processed, and then you don't have to voluntarily think, oh, I should move my hand away, this is really hot. Okay? Because as we know, our nervous system works quickly, but not instantly. And so if that message needs to get to our brain and we need to make a decision about moving our hand, that's going to take some time. And that time is going to cause an increase in damage to our skin. So these reflexes are often protective so that we don't damage ourselves. But again, they work in the same way. We have a sensory neuron connected to an interneuron in the spinal cord, and then right back out to the motor neuron. So there are many diseases and disorders of the nervous system that affect millions of people. We'll talk about a few of these in the next couple slides here. Cerebral palsy is one of them. And cerebral palsy is caused often by damage to the brain, usually during fetal development or birth. A lack of blood flow, a lack of oxygen to the developing fetus or to the baby as it's born can lead to damage to the brain. And this damage can then result in difficulty in speech and motor function, sometimes paralysis, tremors, uncontrollable shaking, poor coordination. And so this is sort of a problem that it happens. It's basically like an injury to the brain because of a lack of oxygen or some other process, and it really can't be cured. You can have therapy, speech therapy, or occupational physical therapy to help improve motor function and speech function, but it's not something that really can be cured. Meningitis. Many of you probably have been vaccinated for meningitis, and you will be before you go to college as well. Meningitis is a disease in which there's an infection and an inflammation of those meninges, those membranes that surround our brain. And there's fluid between those layers of membranes. And if that fluid builds up, if there's swelling there, that can put pressure on the brain, and that could lead to damage as that pressure builds up. It can be caused by bacteria, it can be caused by virus, it can just sometimes happen. And so if it's bacterial meningitis, often an antibiotic can be used to treat it. We can be vaccinated against certain types of viruses that are responsible for meningitis. So it's a vaccine you probably will get and maybe already have got. Strokes. A stroke is caused by a lack of blood flow to a part of the brain. Okay? And it could be caused for multiple reasons. Sometimes a stroke happens because a blood clot forms, lodges in an artery leading to the brain, and stops the flow of blood to that area. Other times it could be due to hemorrhaging in the brain, rupturing of a blood vessel, which results in the same thing, a loss of blood flow to that certain part of the brain. And we know that when cells do not have adequate supply of oxygen in blood, they soon start to die. And so it can lead to damage to whatever area of the brain was inhibited from getting blood. You know, and if a person has a stroke, if it's due to a blood clot, sometimes they can be given anti-clotting agents, medicines that reduce the amount of clotting in their blood. They can try to break up blood clots. And also, they can then treat the various effects of the stroke. In the areas that were damaged, they can try to help improve those symptoms. Polio, another disease we don't really think about much anymore, but used to affect millions and millions of people throughout the world. We basically have nearly eradicated polio through vaccines. And polio was caused by a virus that damaged motor neurons, would lead to paralysis, weakness, muscle atrophy, which muscles basically just sort of breaking down over time. But today, again, because of immunizations, because of vaccines, we've eliminated polio almost completely. Just looking at some pictures here. Cerebral palsy, again, it depends on where the damage in the brain was. Will determine what sort of effects there are and which functions might be impaired. Okay. Meningitis, that's what this diagram is showing. Again, you see the fluid there that separates these layers of the meninges. And if it becomes infected and swollen, puts pressure on the brain. Okay. This is showing the effects of a stroke, and again, it could be due to hemorrhaging, to bleeding in the brain, okay, where blood vessels rupture due to some underlying weakness, or could be due to blood clots stopping the flow of blood. Okay. And this diagram is just showing the various motor neurons that can be affected by polio. A few more. MS, multiple sclerosis, you may have heard of, fairly common neurological disease. And MS is caused by the autoimmune destruction of the myelin insulation that surrounds neurons. We know that myelin helps allow nerve impulses to pass more quickly and more efficiently down the neuron. And if that myelin is damaged or destroyed, it leads to problems in the transmission of these neurological impulses. Doesn't really have a definite cure or treatment. Often the symptoms are treated, but the symptoms could be double vision, a lack of coordination, control of muscles, fatigue. There's various things that are responsible, and sometimes those symptoms sort of come and go depending on the type of MS that a person has. But it's often an autoimmune disease, meaning your own immune system is responsible for damaging this myelin sheath. There's many types of diseases, some types of arthritis, or diabetes are autoimmune diseases. It's your body's own immune system damaging your own body for some reason. Parkinson's disease is due to a lack of dopamine in the brain, which helps regulate motor abilities and so forth. And Parkinson's disease, a person affected by it, they have tremors or shaking, difficulty walking, difficulty in other motor abilities. And there's not a cure for Parkinson's disease. There are certain drugs that can be used to help with some of the symptoms, but it's not something that can be cured. Alzheimer's disease is, again, another neurological disease. The cause, the main cause is unknown. There's some genetic predisposition to Alzheimer's, but it leads to the degeneration of brain neurons, especially those associated with memory. Symptoms include dementia, loss of memory, and so forth. My grandmother had Alzheimer's, so we watched her, and over time she slowly kind of lost her memory of people and different things. But interestingly, she could remember, my grandmother could remember things from when she was a child. She was in her 80s, her late 80s, but she still could remember things that she did as a child very, very clearly and distinctively, but she couldn't remember things that happened to her that, 2 hours beforehand. So it's a sort of a strange disease in which parts of the memory are affected, and it's due to damage to those neurons. Finally, the last one we'll talk about, epilepsy. Can be caused by genetics or a tumor or just a general injury to the brain. And an epilepsy, seizures are a result, and they can be grand mal seizures, which are convulsions and a person loses complete control of their body. It's because the neurons in the brain are sort of discharging randomly, causing for that uncontrollable movement. Or there could be petite mal seizures, which are sort of when a person having this type of seizure, you probably wouldn't even notice. They just might sort of close their eyes and sort of zone out for a few seconds. And it's a sort of a different type of seizure that's caused by some types of epilepsy. There are medications that can be given to help treat some of these symptoms of epilepsy. And again, here you see the effects of MS, the damage to the myelin sheathing. Okay, you can see Alzheimer's. When scientists look at the brain of a person with Alzheimer's, they see degeneration in their brain, in the actual brain tissue itself. And then you see, again, Parkinson's disease and some of the symptoms associated with it.
Does Michael J. Fox have Parkinson's disease?
Yep, he does. Muhammad Ali, also Parkinson's disease. Somebody else I just read about, famous celebrity. I just want to show you a quick video.
This month, many countries around the world will be spreading awareness on multiple sclerosis events, a disease that affects millions of people worldwide. But what exactly is multiple sclerosis? MS
Neighborhoods to around the region. Join News Channel 2 anchors Jason Collis and Katrina Smith with Storm Tracker 2 meteorologist Jill Reel, helping you plan.
Your body. Cells which we've talked about many times in our previous videos. These neurons are able to send signals all throughout the body at incredible speeds, in part because of the fatty coating that surrounds them, something called myelin or the myelin sheath. This myelin insulates the impulses and allows the nerve signals to reach their destination. However, in the case of MS, this is where the issues occur. The immune system is designed to fight a disease from viruses, bacteria, parasites, or other agents, and it does so by distinguishing these things from healthy tissue. But in the case of MS, the immune system ends up attacking the myelin in what is classified as an autoimmune disorder.